I heard this from a friend of mine who was a nursing student at another university. He told it as something that happened to him during one of his night shifts while he was doing clinical rotations in a hospital. That night, a 9-year-old girl had passed away in the pediatric ward. It wasn't unexpected, but it was somewhat difficult for everyone involved, as you can imagine. My friend was assigned to perform post-mortem care for her, which meant preparing the body after death. He said it was his first time doing that on a child, so he was already on edge to begin with. He carried out the procedure, cleaned the body, and made sure everything was done according to protocol. Now, as part of the hospital's policy, it is important that they attach a red identification bracelet on the right wrist of the patient who had been pronounced dead, and made sure it was securely fastened before finishing. This is to let everyone know that person has passed away. Once everything was done, he left the room and headed towards the elevators to go down to another floor. The hallway was quiet, and he pressed the wait button and waited for the doors to open. When they did, he stepped inside. The moment he stepped into the elevator, he heard movement behind him. He turned and saw the little girl was running towards the elevator. It was her, all right. The same face and the same hospital gown. He didn't wait to see if she would reach the doors. Immediately, he began smashing the close button over and over until the doors shut completely. And when the elevator began moving, he was steadying himself, and it was only then he realized he wasn't alone in there. There was an older woman in a hospital gown standing with him. She looked at him and asked him why he had closed the door on a child trying to get in. He tried to explain what he had just seen. He told her that the child had already died, and that he himself had just performed the post-mortem care on her, and that finally, she had been wearing a red identification bracelet on her right wrist, which marked her as deceased according to hospital protocol. The woman listened, and then slowly raised her right arm. On her wrist was the same red bracelet. She looked at him and said, "Like this?" He was found unconscious inside the elevator a short time later, and after that, he refused to return to that hospital. I heard this from a nurse I worked with, and he told it as something that happened directly to him. It took place on a 5th-floor neurology unit in a hospital where he had been working for a while, so he was familiar with the layout and the staff, etc. He was sitting at the nurse's station during a relatively quiet part of the shift, just doing his routine charting. Now, the unit had a set of double doors at the main entrance, and from where he was sitting, he had a clear view of anyone coming in or out. Well, there was one point he saw a man in white nursing attire walk through those doors and head down the hallway. He didn't recognize the person immediately, but that wasn't unusual, because different staff rotated through the unit, especially from other departments, so it didn't raise any immediate concern. The man walked like he knew where he was going, and went straight into one of the patient rooms that happened to be empty at the time. A few minutes passed, and the nurse realized the man had not come back out. This was making him start to feel off. Now, the room was unoccupied, and there was no reason for anyone to go in there at all. And so curiosity got the better of him, and he decided it would be the responsible thing to go and check. So he walked down the hall and went into the room. It appeared to be empty at first. There was no one inside, there was no detectable movement, and nothing seemed out of place. The window was closed. The bathroom was empty. And there was nowhere someone could have gone without coming back through the hallway. He stepped back out and went straight to the double doors at the entrance. When he opened them, 2 respiratory therapists were standing right outside chatting, and he asked them if anyone had just come through. Both of them said no. They added that they had been standing there the entire time chatting, and that no one had passed through the doors in either direction. Well, that didn't line up with what he had just seen. Later on, when one of his co-workers came back from lunch, He told her what had happened. He described the man in the white uniform and how he walked into the empty room and never came back out. She listened and then responded like it was nothing out of the ordinary. "Oh, that's just Bob." Though he later admitted he didn't remember the actual name she used, she went on to explain that years earlier, a licensed vocational nurse who worked on that unit had been accused of molesting a child. According to the story, he believed he was about to be arrested, and before that could happen, he went into that same room and jumped out of the window. She said people on that unit did see him from time to time, not constantly, but enough that it had become something people didn't really question anymore. It was just like he was replaying his final moments while being alive. I used to work at a state institution for individuals with developmental disabilities. At one point, our usual building was being remodeled, so our entire unit was temporarily relocated to another building on the property. It wasn't a place we were used to, and everything just felt slightly off, because it wasn't our usual environment. But we adjusted. This happened during an evening shift. It was the second shift, so things were still active, but starting to settle down. I was working in a locked unit designed for residents with pica, meaning individuals who have a tendency to eat non-food items. Because of that, security was taken very seriously. Some of the residents would ingest absolutely anything they could get their hands on, so keeping track of everyone was critical. One of those residents was a man called Larry. He was very well known to staff because of how extreme his behavior could be. He would try to eat clothing, pens, belts, and anything else within reach. He also had a very distinct way of walking. I would describe it as an uneven gait, and one that you could recognize immediately even from a distance. On top of that, he always wore the same bright yellow t-shirt with a large smiley face on it, which made him the easier to identify. At one point during the shift, I was walking down the hallway outside the unit when I saw Larry. He was moving away from the ward, heading down the hall like he had just gotten out. There was no hesitation in my mind. I could see the shirt, I could see the gait. It was him, everything matched. That immediately set off alarm bells, because he was not supposed to be out of the locked unit, and if he was loose in the building, this was a serious situation. I didn't try to approach him on my own, because he was known to resist being redirected and usually required at least 2 staff members to safely escort him back. I went straight into the ward and told the other staff that Larry was out in the hallway. We moved quickly, because with him, even a short amount of time unsupervised could turn into a medical emergency. We were back out in the hallway within seconds, definitely less than 15, and he was gone. The hallway was now empty. There was nowhere obvious he could have turned or hidden in that short amount of time, but he was not there anymore. We split up immediately and started searching. Every available staff member joined in. We checked other units, stairwells, common areas, even outside the building itself, and with a number of people looking, the search covered a lot of ground very quickly. Yet within 10 minutes we still hadn't found him. At that point, I was getting ready to call the house supervisor to report that we had a missing resident, which is a major incident in that setting. But before I could make the call, one of the bathroom doors opened, and Larry walked out with another staff member. He was completely calm and normal, like nothing had happened. The staff member with him explained that Larry had been in the bathroom for at least the last 30 minutes, getting a bath, and had not left the ward at all. I was just trying to process it because I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a quick glimpse or anything I could have mistaken. I saw him clearly walking down the hallway with his exact posture and that same yellow shirt. I took a lot of teasing from the other staff that night. Everyone thought I had imagined it or mixed him up with someone else, even though there really isn't anyone else who looked or moved like him. And it turned into a bit of a joke for the rest of the shift. The next day, after the story had made its rounds, someone mentioned something I hadn't known. Larry had an identical twin brother who had died in that same building about 10 years earlier. Years ago, I worked at the old Peter Brent Brigham Hospital, back before everything fully transcended to the newer facilities. We had just moved into the new tower, and the original hospital building was scheduled for demolition. A few of my co-workers and I decided to walk through the old unit one last time before it was gone. It was mostly out of nostalgia, just wanting to see the place where I had spent so much time before it disappeared for good. The building felt strange almost immediately. It wasn't abandoned, but it was just empty. The equipment had been cleared out, the rooms were bare, and the usual background noise of the hospital was gone. The quiet made every step echo a little more than I thought it should. We ended up passing by what used to be a large men's ward. It was the kind of room that had held multiple patients at once, but by then it should have been completely empty, of course. As we walked past, we all noticed movement on the inside, and we definitely saw figures in the room. At first it didn't even register as strange. It almost made sense in a way. Maybe someone had come back in, or something had been left unfinished. Well, one of my coworkers stepped closer to the doorway and leaned in to get a better look, and pulled back almost immediately. Her face went completely pale, and she didn't say anything right away, which of course, that just made me more curious. I stepped forward and looked into the ward myself. Inside, I saw two older men sitting on one of the beds. They looked completely normal at first, just sitting there and talking to each other like patients might have done hundreds of times before. There was nothing exaggerated or distorted about them, no obvious sign that anything was wrong at all. If you didn't know the context, it would have looked like a completely ordinary scene. I stepped back and looked at my coworker, expecting her to explain what had just freaked her out so badly. Then she told me that she recognized them. She gave me their names, something like Harry and Tom, though I can't remember them specifically anymore, and said that they had both been frequent patients in that ward, and even made a comment about how they'd been a handful when they were alive. Then she added that they weren't alive anymore. She said there had always been rumors that she heard that they still hung about after they passed away, but as far as she knew, no one had actually seen them there before. Safe to say that cut our visit short. I've worked as a nurse in a cancer center for years, mostly on night shifts, and this happened a while back, and I still think about it because none of us could fully explain it, but I'd like to get your take on it. So we had a patient with end-stage pancreatic cancer who was actively dying. They were extremely weak and hadn't been able to get out of bed for days. We had to use a hoist to move them, and even small movements took a lot out of them. Mentally, though, they were still clear. Well, one night, sometime after midnight, we heard screaming from their room. A few of us ran in right away, expecting to find them distressed in bed, but the bed was empty. For a moment it didn't even register. Then we saw them in the corner of the room, crouched near the window, pointing at it and yelling, "They're here! Stop them!" There was no one there. It was just the window, letting in the dark from outside. They were completely terrified, though, and kept pointing and would not look away at whatever seemed to be right in front of them. What didn't make sense was how they got there. This was someone who couldn't stand or walk, and yet had somehow gotten out of bed and across the room without anyone hearing it. And we had to use a hoist to get them back in bed. Even then, they kept looking towards the window, like they didn't want to turn their back on it. One of the nurses stayed with them after that because none of us felt right leaving them alone. Yet the fear didn't go away. It would ease slightly and then come back in a wave. At one point, they grabbed the nurse's hand and asked, "You see them too, right?" When she said no, they looked worse. Like that confirmed something for them. And they died that same night. Afterwards, we tried our very best to explain it away medically. It might have been the oxygen levels, neurological changes, or the meds. But honestly, nothing fully accounted for both the hallucination and the fact that they physically got out of bed in that condition. That part I can't stress enough. It would have been nigh impossible. Obviously, that left a lot of us quite uneasy, pointing at something none of us could see and seeing something terrible before they met their end. And it's one of those cases that never really left me. Would it leave you? We used to have a room in our medical intensive care unit that staff eventually stopped using for patients altogether. It was room 12, and the reason wasn't anything official or documented, but it was something we were all aware of. Over time, patients who were assigned to that room started reporting the same thing. Not similar, but near identical descriptions. That would be, they would say that there was a woman in the room who would be standing or sitting near the bedside, wearing a white habit like a nun. They all described her as young, probably around 30s, and said she would be rocking back and forth slowly. But what stood out most was that none of the patients ever said she interacted with them directly. She didn't speak or made eye contact, and every single description included the same detail, that she was always facing away from them and looking towards the window. Now, the window in that room was positioned on the patient's left side, slightly above the head of the bed, so anyone lying down would have to turn slightly to see it. It overlooked a section of hospital ground where there was an old cemetery. Several nuns who had been affiliated with the hospital years ago were buried there. At first, staff assumed it was related to sundowning or general confusion. Many of the patients in the medical intensive care unit were critically ill, and it's not uncommon for them to experience delirium, especially at night. That explanation made sense early on, and most of us went with it. But the reports kept coming in, and the consistency was honestly hard to ignore, because it was different patients with very different conditions and different levels of awareness, and somehow they were all describing the same figure in the same place, doing exactly the same thing. It almost started to sound like some kind of elaborate patient hoax, but of course, that's impossible. Well, at some point, the story of a nun called Mary started circulating among the staff. According to what people said, she had died in a car accident near the hospital back in the 50s. She was around 30 at the time, which matched what patients described when they saw her, and there was never anything official tying her to the room, just something passed along between staff over the years. But the details lined up closely enough that people started connecting the two. Eventually, the decision was made to stop placing patients in room 12, and the room was taken out of rotation and turned into a storage space instead. Even after that, most staff avoided going in there alone, unless it was absolutely necessary. I've worked in long-term care for a long time, most of those years on the overnight shift from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. I don't really have a big single story, but a collection of smaller things that kept happening. So there's one unit in particular in our facility that has a reputation. A lot of staff, including me, have had the same experience there. You'll be sitting at the nurse's station doing charting, when out of the corner of your eye you'll see someone walk past. It's clear enough that you'll register it immediately, but when you look up there'll be no one there. Now, it doesn't just happen once or twice. It's been reported by different people on different shifts over a long period of time. It's common enough that people joke about it and ask new staff if they've seen the ghost yet. Residents have reported things too. Every so often, one will complain about children being in their rooms or running in the hallway in the middle of the night. We've had multiple residents in different rooms on the same morning asking about the little boy and whether he was still around. They weren't interacting with each other, and there wasn't anything going on in the building that would explain it. That's not to mention the times where there have been residents who will look past you and refer to the girl behind you, like someone is standing right there. When you turn to check, there's no one there. It's happened enough times that it doesn't even surprise most of the staff anymore. On top of that, there are smaller things that have happened here and there. Call lights going off in empty rooms, doors closing on their own, or just certain rooms that feel unwelcome for no clear reason. Working overnight probably makes all of it feel more intense. Most of the time we keep the lights low so we don't disturb the residents, and everything looks different in that sort of lighting. There are also a couple of experiences that feel different from the rest. One of them involved my mother-in-law when she was in the intensive care unit and near the end of her life. She had been unresponsive for a while. Before she was hospitalized, she had been talking a lot about her childhood, which had been difficult. When she was around 6 or 7 years old, she witnessed her mother being hit by a bus and dying right in front of her. After that, her father became abusive, and it was something that affected her deeply for the rest of her life. But while she was in the hospital lying in bed and not responding to anything, there was a moment when she suddenly opened her eyes. She looked up towards the ceiling and focused on something that we couldn't see. Then she smiled and lifted her arms upwards like a small child asking to be picked up. After that, her eyes closed and she passed away. One final experience happened on my wedding day. My brother had died 7 months earlier in a car accident at 19. As my mother was driving to the church, she was thinking about him and wishing he could be there. While she was driving, the inside of the car suddenly filled with the smell of roses. She said it was strong enough that it didn't feel like something faint or imagined. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the smell disappeared completely. Was it my brother? I guess I'll never know for sure. But I'd like to think in a way, it was him making my mum know that he's okay and happy for us both. I've had a few experiences over the years working in long-term care, and some of them fall into that category people talk about, like residents knowing exactly when they're going to die. I've seen that more than once, but there is one story that has stayed with me more than any other. But let me give you the necessary context first. At the time, I was supervising a midnight shift, and there was one staff member I wasn't comfortable with called Daniel. There was something about having him there overnight that never sat right with me, especially around vulnerable residents. I couldn't point to one specific incident, but it was enough that I acted on it. I went into the facility myself, let him go, and took over his shift that same night. That decision turned out to be more important than I ever expected. Not long after Daniel was fired, he set one of the buildings on fire in retaliation. The building had sleeping residents inside. Obviously, everything changed instantly, because the alarms were blaring, smoke was everywhere, and we were trying to get everybody out as quickly as possible. It's extremely chaotic, almost akin to being in an earthquake, and if you've lived it, you'll know just how unpleasant it is. Well, there's a moment in situations like these when you genuinely believe you might not get out alive, and you become very aware of the people around you. There were residents and staff trapped in that building, and for a short time it felt like we might not all make it out. This creates a sort of connection between people that doesn't just go away afterwards. Thankfully, we did manage to evacuate the building, everyone got out, but one resident sadly did pass away a few days later from complications related to the fire. After that, I struggled with working nights, because even if everything was calm at work, I would think I smelled smoke, or heard something burning. I'd walk the halls and check over and over, sometimes waking the groundskeeper who lived on the property because I was convinced something was wrong. And there would be nights where I would just sit at the nurse's station, trembling, trying to keep it together. There was one resident called Margaret, who became a kind of comfort for me during that time. She had suffered a stroke years earlier and had no short-term memory at all. She never remembered who I was or why I was there, even after years within the facility. Her days and nights were completely reversed, so she was usually awake during my shift, wandering the halls, humming quietly or sitting nearby. I started keeping a small dish of candy at the nurse's station and would use it to get her to sit with me. I never explained this to anyone, But having another person there, even if she didn't really know who I was, made my nights easier. She would sit, eat candy, talk, and I would do my work without really feeling completely alone. And by the time she stood up, she wouldn't even remember she had been there, or that she had eaten anything. Not long after the fire, Margaret passed away. And after that, the nights felt exceptionally empty, especially when I had to cover the overnight shifts. Well, one night in particular, I was sitting at the nurse's station, and it was getting to me. I was convinced that I could smell smoke again, and I could feel that panic building within me. I was alone and breathing, trying to calm myself down, when another resident called Katerina came out of the hallway. Katerina was someone I knew well. She had been in the building during the fire, so she understood what happened, even if we never spoke about it directly. She was originally from Germany and had lived through difficult experiences in her life. I pulled myself together enough to ask if she needed anything, and she said she couldn't sleep and thought it might be nice to sit and chat. I was relieved to have the company, truth be told, and said that would be great. And after sitting down, she paused for a moment and then said, "Margaret just came and woke her up." I assumed she meant that she had been dreaming and gently reminded her that Margaret had passed away. Katerina nodded and said she knew that, but she insisted Margaret had come to her. She said Margaret told her that when I worked nights I would get afraid and needed someone to sit with me so I could do my work, and that I was having a difficult night. This really caught me off guard, because I had never told anyone about that. Not about the candy, and not about asking Margaret to sit with me, ever. Before I could really respond, Katerina stood up, walked behind the nurse's station, and reached directly for the candy dish I kept tucked away. She sat down next to me and started talking to me about her life when she was younger, growing up in Germany. She stayed there with me for a while, just chatting. Katerina passed away a few years later, but I've never forgotten the night, or the way it happened. I got called to a code in the hallway during a transfer from the emergency department to one of the inpatient floors. The patient was being moved on a stretcher with a technician accompanying her, and from everything we were told, she had been stable enough for transport. This wasn't expected to become anything urgent, but by the time I arrived, the situation had already morphed. The patient was now unresponsive, and the team was starting resuscitation efforts right there in the hallway. Equipment was being brought in, and the people were moving quickly to get things rolling, and it turned into a full code within seconds. After everything was over, I spoke with the technician who had been with her during the transfer. He was still shaken, trying to explain what had happened in moments before she collapsed. He said they had been talking normally as they moved down the hall. She was alert, talking and answering questions, and there was nothing unusual about anything. Then, without any warning, she looked upwards like she was focusing on something above or ahead of them. And then she said very calmly, "Oh, here comes God. I think I'll go with him." And then she went unresponsive. There was no gradual decline, you understand. No sign anything was about to happen. She just gave that statement, and her body died. I had this from another nurse I worked with a while back. She had been floated to an oncology unit for the night shift at a hospital where she used to work. It wasn't her usual floor, so she didn't know the patients well, but she was assigned to someone who was actively dying. The patient had been unconscious for several days, and had no response to voice or touch, and from everything the team knew, there was no awareness left. At some point during the night, she went into the room for a routine check. The lights were low, everything was quiet, and nothing seemed out of place at first. That was until she noticed the patient was positioned higher up in the bed than before, like they had somehow moved. Before she could really process that, the patient suddenly opened her eyes and looked directly at her. She described it as immediate and focused, neither confused or groggy, and the patient clearly spoke, "Don't let them take me." The nurse said it caught her completely off guard, and when she asked her who was going to take her, the patient lifted her hand and pointed upwards towards the space above her head. "That black thing up there." There was nothing visible, just the ceiling, but the patient's expression didn't change. She looked genuinely afraid. Within minutes of saying that, the patient died. There was no further movement or speech. The nurse said she stood there afterwards trying to make sense of how someone who had been unresponsive for days could suddenly wake up, speak so clearly, and then pass almost immediately after. We talked about possible explanations like terminal lucidity or neurological changes at the end of life, and those things do happen. But what stayed with her wasn't just that the patient woke up, but it's the certainty when she spoke of that thing in the ceiling that the nurse couldn't see. Do you think there was something there? Something that had come to take her? I guess I'll never know. I'm a CNA who's worked in a nursing home that's nearly 70 years old, where so many elderly patients have passed through its doors over the decades. One wing has been converted into a specialized Alzheimer's/dementia/mental illness unit. It's a locked-down, dark hall and relatively quiet. The layout was T-shaped. At the top sat the dining room, the door to the main building, the smoker's deck exit, and the nurse's station. The long stem ran back through the patient rooms to a garden door at the end, with hallway cameras feeding the TV behind the station. That night, short-staffed as always, I was working alone back there when the garden door started banging open and shut rhythmically. I figured it was probably Mrs. Hardgrove, our resident wanderer who loved late-night air, so I grabbed a blanket from the warmer, flipped on the outside light, and stepped out. But the garden was totally empty, with no footprints or anything that would account for the noise. I did a full sweep inside, I checked every room, looked under beds and peered into bathrooms. And all residents were accounted for. So I sat back down at my station, when the banging hit again. I glanced at the monitor, and that was the moment I saw a very tall man standing at the garden door. I knew it was a man in my gut, his broad back to the camera peering out the window like he was waiting for someone. We had no ambulatory male residents at all. The guys were bedbound or confined to wheelchairs, and I slowly rolled my chair into the hallway entrance and peered down the long stretch. But there was no one there. Yet the screen still showed him clear as day, standing in place. I locked the station, grabbed my stuff, and marched up front to demand a partner from the charge nurse. And I never worked solo on that hall again, not for any amount of overtime. This was my second nursing job, and was considerably different from the first, which was at a rehabilitation at a mental health care facility. This was a juvenile detention facility. That's right, a kids' jail. I was not nearly as intimidated by this as I admittedly should have been. I figured my position was in the wellness department, and that containing combative children would be the support staff's responsibility, since they were specifically trained for it. I just needed to attend the children's health concerns, do medical passes, and basically tend to my own affairs and business. So with this in mind, I began my job as a nurse in a juvenile detention facility. Children acting absolutely buck wild was nothing new to me. My very first day, a teen boy from the sex offender cottage was brought to an intake cell through the Sally Port and held in one of our cells there until we nursing staff could assess him. When the nurse who was training me and I got there, we had to do an evaluation on him to see the level of severity of his injuries so we could treat and document them. This lad had repeatedly slammed his forehead against the inside of his intake cell and had managed to get about a quarter-sized goose egg on his forehead. It wasn't very pretty, but I would find things like this, although certainly not common, were not exactly rare either. I kind of had a baptism by fire first shift. I was the evening shift nurse. When she came through intake that night, a chubby, cherubic 8-year-old girl shuffled over and sat down in one of our chairs, looking scared and forlorn. Her messy, loose, dark brown curls hung midway over her chestnut brown eyes. For the sake of the story, we'll call her Angel. The facility service manager asked if she could stay with me for a while, since the kids had decided that Saturday evening was a perfect time to riot. He and the support staff had their hands more than full. Of course, she could sit over by my nurse's station and I'd keep a watchful eye on her. My evening med pass was done, so it was not a problem. She was a literal babe in the woods. She was apprehensive and appeared to be somewhat overwhelmed. I couldn't imagine being and holding as an adult, let alone an 8-year-old girl. She had to have been terrified. To her credit, she never cried nor whined. Honestly, she impressed me with her level of maturity and awareness about the situation. Maybe since hindsight is 2020, I miscalculated her maturity and awareness for what it actually was: disconnect and apathy. I clocked out at 10 p.m, and as it was approaching that time, the kids wouldn't stop rioting just because I was going home soon, so the manager and support staff were all still swamped. Angel was quietly sitting in her chair and continued to nod off, her little brown bouncy curls framing her round, sweet, pretty face. I decided, since I was leaving soon, to lay her down on a cot in the infirmary and let her sleep. It was almost 10 and she was 8. She'd had a very emotional day. She had to have been exhausted. I laid her down on the cot. I fluffed up her pillow and grabbed her a few blankets from the warmer to tuck her in. She practically fell asleep as I explained to her that the intake staff were just a few feet away, and if she needed anything she could just go get them. And that was my introduction to Angel's heavenly side. I don't remember how long it took for me to see Angel's demonic side. I just remember it didn't take that long. To be on a med pass and see her in the throes of an all-out nuclear level meltdown were a real shock to the system. The support staff included several men who were between 6 foot and 6'5", and between 250 and 300 pounds. The first time I saw Angel kicking, screaming, biting, and hitting, while 4 men of this size and 2 women of much smaller stature tried to restrain her, I was in a complete state of shock. Keep in mind that I'd worked as a surgery technician for 10 years in labor and delivery before. I went back to nursing school, so I'd seen my fair share of kicking, bucking, and fighting. In all honesty, very little shocked me at this point. What did shock me was the quickness with which Angel morphed into a kicking, screaming, biting, unholy terror when she felt slighted in any way or heard the word no when she demanded something, because she very rarely requested anything. So I'm on my evening med pass to the inside cottages. To give you a clearer visual, we had cottages inside the fenced-in area of the facility and a cottage outside of the fenced-in area. The cottage where Angel was housed was one of the inside cottages. The cottages had all of the kids in their rooms in a lockdown state due to Angel having a full-on meltdown, and the support staff were trying to get her under control. I decided to come back to that cottage once things had calmed down and the kids weren't confined to their rooms. As I was exiting the cottage, Angel was being restrained right by the door that I needed to use to leave. 6 full-grown adults were trying to restrain this 8-year-old little girl so she wouldn't be a harm or hazard to herself and others. She was bucking like a bronco, screaming, thrashing around using foul language that I didn't even know at her age, and threatening staff. I looked at her in the face and into her eyes as I was leaving, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. This child looked completely different from the chubby, cherubic little girl I tucked away on her evening intake. Her pupils were so dilated that the chestnut brown irises of her eyes were now jet black. She had very little white sclera showing as well. This wasn't just low-level light pupil dilation either. The black damn near took over her entire eye. Her voice unnerved me the most. It was guttural and deep like a man's. She didn't sound like a little girl at all, and the hatred that accompanied that glare was beyond unnerving. It was downright scary, and I do not shake easy. My gut instinct was to get away, and to do so quickly. And that's precisely what I did. I finished up my med pass to the other cottages and came back to Angel's cottage. Upon my return, I learned they had taken her to intake, where she was placed in a cell. She hurt herself during her outburst, and that's putting it very lightly, and I would need to do a physical assessment and report on her injuries when I got back to the wellness department. So with apprehension, I headed to wellness to drop off my med bag, and then over to intake, which was right next door. When I got there, I was told Angel had really flipped out, and she was placed in her cell. She, like the boy on my first day, had also banged her head repeatedly against the cell wall and gotten a goose egg on her forehead. This was a common occurrence for any of the youths who were placed in a cell as a form of revolting against being put somewhere they couldn't continue to harm staff or other inmates. I entered her cell with apprehension. She sat with slumped shoulders on the concrete bench in a suicide wrap. Gone was the helliest demon that had been kicking, biting, hitting, and bumping the support staff with the obsidian eyes. Before me sat a broken and bewildered little girl, just like the cherubic child I'd seen on her first night there. She looked up at me with pain, sorrow, and regret, and a huge red and pink knot smack dab in the middle of her head. Granted, you'd be correct in thinking the confused look on her face was partially from conking her head. That was a tiny part of it, though. This child looked like she was lost and didn't know what was going on. I asked her the typical questions, what hurt and where, so I could properly document and treat her injuries. She answered sheepishly, and you could tell she was completely spent. I asked about the incident in the cottage, and she was at a loss. She remembered nothing. Yes, people can get blackout angry, and here's the thing. This child would go from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. There was no boiling point for Angel. Things were fine until they weren't, and unfortunately for us, we would never know when the volcano would erupt. I honestly don't think Angel knew either. I just know I personally witnessed a child who was normally very sweet absolutely explode out of nowhere for no apparent reason. Then she'd immediately calm down and would never recall what happened or why. She'd just be very confused and very apologetic. To quote Red from The Shawshank Redemption, I do believe the first 2 years were the worst for him, and I also believe if things had gone on that way, this place would have gotten the best of him. Except, in Angel's case, it was 2 months, and he was a she. I personally tried a few different approaches to keep Angel calm. What ended up working the best was something simple. At the time, I had a papillon who loved to sing with me, and it made for really cute videos. Angel really liked my pup, and I made her promise for every day she could go the entire day without acting out and getting a write-up, she'd get a brand new video made just for her of my pup and me singing. It was more my pup singing than me, and I'm sure she was grateful for that. This girl adored the dog. She loved the videos. They were always the highlight of her day. She would have done anything to get to watch him, including not flipping out on staff and causing incidents, because we had a deal and she was very aware of it. If she showed out, there would be no video for Angel that day. She'd come over to the wellness department and I'd ask if she'd been good that day. Kids being kids, they tend to lie to cover bad behavior, and I told her I'd check with the youth development supervisor at her cottage to make sure she was honest. She was always truthful, probably because she knew I'd check. Mostly she did pretty well. There were days when I'd ask if she'd been good, and she'd look at the floor and shake her head. No. Her bottom lip would quiver, and tears would well up in her eyes. She'd explained that she didn't know what happened, and couldn't even remember what it was that she'd done wrong. I'd almost cave and show her the video anyway, but I simply couldn't do it. If I did, she would act with reckless abandonment, knowing that she could see the videos anytime she wanted and didn't have to worry about her outbursts, and that wasn't our deal. All this is to say that I knew the child. This was a child who would have kept her behavior in check if it meant watching my papa looking at the ceiling and howling. Now, some of you may say this was simply a child acting out or a child with mental illness, although I do feel both played a part in Angel's behavior. I know deep in my soul that there was something more than that. The inhuman strength, the Stygian eyes, the deep voice of a man who smokes 2 packs a day, the memory loss and lack of recall, the minimal or non-existent triggers before a full-on raging maniacal fit. If there ever were a case of demonic possession that I've witnessed with my own eyes, Angel would be it. She literally ticks all the boxes on the checklist. If you find this ending anticlimactic, dear listener, let me add one last detail I never mentioned when introducing you to Angel at all. The reason she came to our facility to begin with. Angel was remanded to our facility at 8 years old for attempted murder. She stabbed her grandmother in the stomach multiple times. An 8-year-old little girl. Still think demonic possession isn't possible in today's world? My ex is a nurse who worked long shifts at Austin Hospital, and she used to come home with these wild stories about a mysterious man that staff kept spotting in random places around the building. This would be in empty hallways, or patient wards, or even the break room late at night, and he would just vanish into thin air right before their very eyes. I always brushed it off as exhaustion or tricks of the fluorescent lights, not to mention that nurses pull crazy hours and see patients come and go all day, so I would expect their minds to be quite numb after the third 12-hour shift in a row. But that skepticism began crumbling away one evening, when we had a close friend admitted to the hospital for some routine surgery, and my ex was assigned to his floor, and kept an eye on his recovery. I swung by after my own workday to visit him, bringing a couple of vending machine snacks and something to lift his spirits while recovering. We chatted for a good half an hour. We were talking about his upcoming discharge, and joked about how the hospital jello tasted like rubber. Before my ex and I said our goodbyes and promised to check in tomorrow, and headed out together so she could crash at my place for once, instead of driving home alone in the dark. As we stepped into the echoing corridor that led toward the bank of elevators, I noticed there was this man about 10 meters ahead of us, walking at a steady pace in scrubs that looked a little dated. He had his back to us, and his head down like he was reading his phone or a chart. He got closer to the elevators just as one dinged and its doors began opening. My ex and I picked up the pace, and we wanted to catch it before it closed. Neither of us wanted to wait for the next one because we were very tired. The man ahead stepped right in without glancing back, his silhouette disappearing into the empty elevator, and we jogged the last few steps. But when we reached the open doors and peered inside, there was no one in there. The elevator was completely empty. There was nowhere he could have gone. My ex and I both saw it, and none of us have an explanation for it. Before that night, I'd always roll my eyes at her stories, but after that, there was definitely an "I told you so" every time she brought it up vibe in her storytelling, and I admit, I might not be able to explain it away, but I definitely saw it. I used to work at a nursing home. The people there were either somatic, psycho, geriatric, mostly Alzheimer's, or were living in one of the independent homes. One time during my night shift, I went out on one of my rounds to inspect an alarm on the 3rd floor. This is standard procedure and is usually nothing, just old people tripping their bed sensors indicating they got out of bed at night. There were 4 departments per floor, each department housing 8 rooms/people, and the way they were built was like in sets of 2 with 3 sets of elevators, one for each side and one big one in the middle. The elevator room was not accessible for the old people with Alzheimer's and was separated by 2 heavy big doors which required a pass to open. So I make my way to one of the departments and exit the elevator and use my passkey to open the department to investigate the bed alarm that went off there. As soon as I arrived, I could clearly see who it was, since the room was next to the elevator and opened up compared to the other closed ones, and, well, people with dementia are not known for their stealth abilities. I went inside to reassure the woman who woke up that everything was fine, and reset her bed alarm while she went to sleep. I was in there for maybe 2 minutes with the door open. As soon as I left the room, I saw 2 heavy chairs that were at the end of the hallway, now blocking the door to the elevator that I had just been through, were now on the opposite side of the hallway, where I'd just seen the chairs before. How had they got there? Someone must have moved them right now, so someone else must be awake. I checked all the rooms. They were all closed up. People lying in bed with no alarms going off on my phone or nothing. So at this point I'm like, holy hell, no one else is awake and could have moved the chairs. How the hell did they get in here? The old people couldn't have moved them in a span of 2 minutes stealthily, let alone move them that fast that if they could move them at all without tripping the bed sensor and then sneakily went back to bed to trick me. They have dementia anyway and incapable of doing so. So at this point, I was noping the hell out of there and went back to my colleagues. I thought maybe my colleagues had pranked me or something. I don't know. I don't know how they would have gotten and left again without me noticing the heavy doors opening, but at this point I thought it must have been the only possible explanation. I mean, they were the only other people who had access to this. So I come in and tell them they're very funny trying to scare me like that, and that nice try, but I wasn't impressed. After all, I'm a man of science, and the supernatural is preposterous. They both look at each other and go, no, we've been sitting here eating pizza this whole time. But we had other colleagues who also had a weird story like yours. At this point, my heart sinks into my chest. I've never been able to deduce how the chairs got moved. Other weird stuff went on in the building, but I could always explain that away. But not this one. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed our trip to the hospital today, and I would like to extend a final special thank you to my members and patrons this month, whose names can be seen on screen. If you'd like to join their ranks and get some cool extra perks, you can follow the links down below to find out more as well. But that's it from me. Stay awesome, guys, and good night.